Good morning. Welcome to day one of Wider Local Studies for 2024. My name is Ellen Forsyth and I work at the State Library of New South Wales with Public Library Services. Wider Local Studies has been planned by public library staff and state library staff in different states and territories in Australia. This seminar would not be possible without a lot of cooperation. This session will be recorded and made available online. Your participation in this is your agreement to being recorded. Text in chat is available as part of these recordings. I acknowledge that this webinar is hosted from the lands of the Wangal people of the Eora Nation. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which you all work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal people and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Australia. In chat, please include your library name and the name of the traditional custodians of the land you are on. It is my pleasure to chair the first session on multicultural collecting, a practice which is relevant to each of our communities. This session will have time for questions after each of the speakers. Please put your questions in chat. First, we will hear from Dr. Chen, who has been undertaking Cantonese language and bilingual oral history recordings. He will have ideas to your libraries to consider for working with First Nations people for local studies, including bilingual oral history recording. I will now hand over to Dr. Chen.
I pay my respects to the Indigenous elders, past, present, and future, especially acknowledging the resilience of the stolen generation, who will never find their way home. As a second-generation migrant, I understand the importance of finding one's place and identity. In my early 20s, visiting country served as a transformative experience, guiding me back to my roots and helping me on my journey of self-discovery. Thank you, Ellen, for inviting me here today. At first, I was over the moon to be invited to this panel, but then I started to worry. How can I offer anything to know-it-all local historians and librarians? In oral history, it is usually me that does the active listening and question asking, not the talking. So perhaps I'll start off with a few questions. Have you been to a country where they speak a language other than your own? Raise your hand. Have you been to a country where they speak a language other than your own? Good. Good to see that some local studies librarians have ventured beyond their backyard. You may lower your hand now. Feel free to type in the chat some of your experiences overseas. Ellen, you may like to read out a few of these responses. Feel free to type in the chat some of your responses and encounters overseas. Ellen, you might like to pick one or two and read out a few responses.
Okay. People saying traveling to places like Japan, people there very patient and kind with understanding. Someone else was Spanish speaking in South America, so they were communicating. Someone saying, sorry, I'm Australian a lot. Yes, so mixed responses.
Yeah, thank you. So have you ever wondered what local studies historians in the overseas country you visited, how they would appreciate your responses, but not knowing the language, it may be hard for them to gather your insights and resources? Now think about your own local communities. Living among us, there may be many long-term, non-English speaking migrants in our communities. Due to language constraints, their stories often go unheard, both by their own families and also the collecting institutions. But I should remind us that every voice should be heard. Migrant stories matter. Don't let them scatter. After all, oral history shares the tale. Community languages ensures that diversity prevails. Now, I must ask you, what is the number one barrier that restricts or stops libraries from having an oral history collection in community language? Type your answer in the chat. Ellen, would you like to read out some of these responses? What is the one thing that stands in your way between the library having an oral history collection in community languages and those that do not?
Well, so far staff resources is coming through, very limited staff resources. Librarians not being fluent in languages to assist in communication of community members, not having anyone to translate, lack of resources is coming through as a strong trend. Lack of connection with communities is another one. Funding for translators.
Yeah, we get a good idea of the sort of issues that
building trust and partnerships with community groups too.
I believe you touched on a number of issues, and some of it will feed into today's presentation. But the one key element that I would like to highlight is that identifying the bilingual oral historian, the go-between the library and the community, is the key to developing your own collection. A while back, the local Chinese community in Cairns wanted their own wanted their own oral history collection, but it didn't get very far, as nobody had the time and, more importantly, the expertise. In Melbourne, I talked to a former curator who mentioned the difficulties. They said they had nobody who knew how to translate. So finding a bilingual oral historian with the right skill set is key. Today, my promise to you is that you leave this session knowing how every local studies librarian can develop an oral history collection in community languages. I'll cover 3 parts. First is an overview of my own journey and how I got into this business of oral history. Second is a six-step process on how libraries can work with bilingual oral historians. And 3, what are the benefits of a multilingual oral history collection? Now, you may be wondering, who is Christopher Chen, or as I'm known in Cantonese as Jen A. Chiu, and what does he know about oral history? I'll start by sharing my journey. In 2007, I was a master's student in Brisbane. I went on a field trip to study Indigenous architecture in Queensland and Northern Territory. During the day, Aboriginal children ran around playing with each other. They knew their community. One afternoon, around the campfire, elders reflected on their lives. Young people will eventually leave for the city, endure the rat race, and some will return to reconnect with country and community. Little did I know that sitting around that campfire on that day would lead me on an unexpected journey, but a much needed one back home overseas. After that trip, I decided to leave uni and find my path. I told Mum I was quitting uni. Actually, I had already dropped out before I told her. I think She must have fainted on the other end of the phone line. And when I told her I was going back to Hong Kong, that definitely nailed the lid on her coffin. You see, she took immense pride in sending me off to uni and imagining a good life. And now she was sobbing hysterically, thinking that she could no longer boast to her cleaning lady friends at work about her son's achievements. I was a failure in her eyes. And she also felt like a failure too. And what's more, all her friends and relatives in Hong Kong would know that we were failing. Or perhaps she was imagining I would be in Hong Kong and playing Mahjong, a Chinese bingo-like game all day and wasting my youth away. Dad and relatives in China couldn't understand my choice either. Given that many young people in Hong Kong and China study hard, study really hard, they learn English, then they leave the country to never return. And yet I had English and I was coming back. There wasn't any understanding, and my Chinese at the time wasn't any good. I would have liked to say to these people, Australia didn't make me tall and proud until I went to China and found my ancestral crowd. But my language skills were so limited at the time, the best I could do was nod my head. During my time away in Hong Kong, I went to Zhongshan, my ancestral homeland, where I met two uncles, one from Australia and the other from China. One was inside the hair salon, sweeping up the hair of the day, and the one outside, my Australian uncle, was outside smoking. I approached my Australian uncle and said, "Uncle, long time no see. I've been dying to hear your story, how we ended up in Australia." Uncle's eyes beamed with delight. "I have many stories to tell," he said. "Let's find the right time." Then somebody in the background yelled out, "Dinner time." And so our interview was cut short. On the last day, I was getting very desperate. Still no stories were told. As promised, and Uncle would soon return to Australia. On the bus ride back to Hong Kong, I fought and won the seat next to my uncle. My prize was a 2-hour-long recorded interview on my MP3 player. About how Uncle had survived his freedom swim out of China, out swimming the sharks for Hong Kong, and all of us Australians on the bus were able to enjoy a vastly different life from our Chinese cousins in China. And because I had come prepared for an interview and had some experience interviewing, I was able to interview, record, and ask follow-up questions in Cantonese on the spot. Somehow, sitting there with my uncle, with my Australian cousins around me, some were chatting, others were snoring. It felt like the Outback experience, but this time we were on an inner city coach. After this interview success, my interest in collecting interviews with other Australian migrants in Cantonese was ignited. Fast forward to 2022. I spent 2 weeks at the National Library in Canberra listening to oral history recordings non-stop. This was another campfire moment for me. Or rather, I felt like I was Simba from The Lion King, listening to his deceased father, Mufasa, who now reappeared as a guiding star. My sense of purpose became clearer as I listened to the knowledge gaps and curiosities of many deceased elders. speaking to English-speaking oral historians in the 1980s and 90s. My mission statement was clarified to record first-generation Cantonese migrant stories for future generations, because first-generation memories are an inheritance we cannot afford to lose. They ensure later generations of Australians will not wonder but know how their ancestors' first steps in the new country Australia was like, but also not miss out on their ancestors' last steps out of their old country. But even with this newfound sense of purpose, I still felt nervous before I began each interview, because I felt it was a huge responsibility to record someone's life properly. But finding my niche as an oral historian helped reassure me. During my decade-long stint in Hong Kong, I cultivated a deep interest in local history and local culture by studying anthropology. After completing my PhD, I am even regarded as an expert of some sort. Other than language and knowledge, I've also accumulated a network of personal connections. The point is, by going against the grain, I left behind the so-called good life to go down the narrow path to where I was meant to be. In fact, my proudest accomplishments to date was expanding the New South Wales State and Australian National Library collection. I know that these collections will be around long after my narrators and I are no longer here. Every time I contribute to these libraries, I feel as if I am proverbially passing a torch for the future generations, so that when the time comes, they can make their own campfires. Ever since, I've been invited to write and speak about my experiences in oral history. But I'm not the only one. Public libraries should keep their eyes open for other potential opportunities, and I will also do the same. Enough about me. Now let's move on to the second aspect of the talk, the 6-step process of how we can conduct oral histories in community languages. First step, I recommend listening to interviews available online at the State or National Library, or in language from overseas libraries. As you listen, pay attention and take notes. Take notes of the good questions, the bad questions, and any missed opportunities. This exercise will help you familiarize yourself with the art of oral history interviewing. Step 2, conduct a pre-interview. This is either in person or over the phone. You share your own background so the narrator is familiar with you, build up trust, and you get to know each other better. Step 3, you consult the library. Talk to the librarians and see if they're interested in adding this interview to their collection. After the library agrees, do more research on the background and the time the person lived and the experiences they may have went through. And make a rough list of possible themes to cover in the interview. Step 4, schedule the interview. Schedule about 3 hours for a 2-hour interview. This gives extra time for paperwork and a coffee before and after the interview. If the interview isn't finished by then, go for round 2 at another time. Step 5, post-interview documentation. After the interview, jot down your thoughts and feelings. Preparing documentation to accompany the recording. This may include bilingual notes of places, people, key dates, events, and major themes that were covered in the interview. This will help the library with cataloging. Step 6, review and feedback. Treat the first interview as a test run. Seek advice and feedback from local studies staff and those with community language expertise and interview experience. By following this 6-step process, you can develop a robust oral history collection in the community language for your library, and it will improve over time. Having covered my story and the interview process, now you're probably wondering, what is the benefit of collecting oral histories in diverse languages? And this is the last point of the talk. Before I come to this aspect, let me discuss 2 unique aspects of bilingual oral histories with migrants. First is language, second is frame of reference. Let me begin with language. During my interviews, I found that Cantonese-speaking migrants switch naturally between 2 languages. For instance, Auntie Chan in Cairns, who's a bilingual in Cantonese and English, when she spoke about her childhood, she recounted her experiences in Cantonese growing up in Malaysia. But the moment she stepped on, the moment she began her life in Australia, everything from then was recorded in English. And this happened twice, when I was doing the pre-interview and doing the actual interview. It's quite strange. In other cases, migrants and descendants who are fluent in one language but not the other, they tend to switch between the languages when they're quoting family members. For example, an elderly migrant who I interviewed mainly in Cantonese, when she was quoting her son, she said a phrase in English. And likewise, descendants of Chinese migrants, when they were quoting their grandparents, they remember a few lines of Chinese and recorded that in language, Chinese language. So this fluidity between the languages reflects the everyday linguistic world of migrants. And linguists and local historians would find it fascinating to have these oral records. They act like a time capsule for outdated place names and idioms. And from my studies in local history, I find that the place names are particularly relevant and useful. Especially, we know that unavoidably they change over time, and having another reference source may mean finding a place on a map or never finding it at all. Beyond language, another unique aspect of interviewing migrants is their dual frame of reference. Migrants tend to be more analytical. They make comparisons between their home country and Australia. For instance, during an interview with Chico Ko, a funeral director, Selina Leung, told her that Chinese migrants compared the cost of burials in their home country to those in Australia. Similarly, in a book about Italian migrants, they were shocked at how Australians treated the elderly, sending them to old people's homes. But in Italy, the custom was to keep family together. These comparisons can help us understand not only migrant mentalities in Australia, but also the conditions back at home, showing how migrants are undeniably and part of 2 interconnected worlds. Oral history is also a meaningful way for both narrators and interviewers to make sense of their own lives. I would like to share a heartfelt message from a narrator who expressed immense gratitude for being interviewed. Gui Bong, throughout her married life, often saw her husband, George Wade, a local identity in Cairns, take the lead role as the spokesperson of the family due to his proficiency in English. George was the eldest son of a prominent Chinese pioneering family in Cairns. Their son, Lawrence, born and raised in Waikato, Australia, struggled to converse with Mum in Cantonese, her native tongue. During our pre-interview session, Lawrence was there and he expressed immense gratitude for the interview, helping the family delve deeper into their heritage. Our interview provided a window into his mother's world. At the conclusion of our recorded interview, Gui Bong expressed the joy at finally having the chance to share her life story after waiting so long. Having heard the benefits to individuals and their families, namely descendants, now you may be wondering, what are the benefits an oral history interview for the interviewer? Taking my wife, Kiko Ko, as an example, she's an exceptional Cantonese-speaking oral historian. A lot of her work can be found at the State Library NSW. Now, I'm not biased, but her work is excellent. Hear me out. She arrived in Australia in the year of the pandemic and before relations between Hong Kong and China further deteriorated. It was a challenging time for her. But as a humanities student who studied Chinese history and later cultural anthropology at university, she was keen to conduct interviews. Through the 10 interviews she conducted with the State and National Library, she gained profound insights into how migrants transitioned between Hong Kong, China, and Sydney, and how they adapted from a Chinese-speaking environment to an English-speaking environment. And the interviews also provide her with a deep understanding of what it means to live, work, and raise a family as a Chinese migrant in Australia. Migrant stories provide a role model for us. And I would like to draw on my first interview with the National Library, where I interviewed Auntie Jenny Lee. Like my Australian uncle, she wasn't comfortable in narrating her life story in English, so we spoke in Cantonese. Auntie Jenny came from a wealthy village family with an overseas Chinese connection. It was only when she came to Australia that she learned how to cook, because she couldn't stand eating steak dinners cooked by her husband day after day. And what's more amazing is that later in life, she ran her own Chinese takeaway shop in Cairns after her husband's grocery shop could no longer compete with Coles Supermarket. Auntie Jenny's story reflects how migrants can overcome challenges in Australia and in the process become a more competent person. And this is what she told me in the interview, that she was more competent, having spent her time in Australia and overcoming such difficulties. And I found this really inspiring, don't you? Her journey serves as a role model, not only for newcomers, but also for those considering migration. During our interview, Auntie Jenny also shared how she used to work 7 days a week, but later reduced her hours so she could spend more time with her children. often taking them to Palm Cove, a beach in Cairns, on a day off. Auntie Jenny's story painted a vivid picture of her new life and Australian experience. Reflecting on her story, I couldn't help but to wonder how differently I would have been brought up if my parents had heard stories like these when they first came to Australia. In essence, interviews not only provide validation for the lives of those interviewed, but they also assist bilingual interviewers such as Kiko and myself in gaining a clearer understanding of our place in the world. Congratulations, you've reached the end of this session. As promised, we have some insights into how local studies librarians can build up their own collection of oral histories in community languages. Considering the lasting benefits, such as providing community role models, societal validation, and preserving community languages, let me leave you with one final question. What is hindering you from gathering a comprehensive library of oral histories in community languages? What barriers do you face in collecting oral histories in community languages? You already know the answer. Finding the bilingual oral historians, a go-between the library and your community. Remember that oral histories play a crucial role in humanizing migration and local history, breathing life into otherwise silent statistics and dry resources. They complement official records such as rate books, birth, death, and marriage certificates, and immigration records, providing a richer and more nuanced understanding of our past. In short, every person's voice is unique. Migrant voices matter. Don't let them scatter. Oral history shares the tale. Community languages ensures that diversity prevails. Thank you.
Thank you. That was absolutely fabulous. Auntie Jenny sounds a remarkable person. There's already questions coming through. Is there a list of bilingual oral historians who can be employed by libraries to conduct interviews?
That's a very good question, and this is beyond the scope of what I've been doing. But I think this is something that could be discussed with oral history associations in different states, and they may have a better idea.
Also, too, it could be that it's looking at different library staff getting trained to be oral history people. It may not be the local study staff. If it's not the local study staff in your library who are bilingual, it might be that it's other library staff who are trained to undertake the interviews. There was a question that a couple of comments that came up really early when you were asking the challenges, and translation came through as a challenge. Now, my personal view, and I will hasten to say it's a personal view, is I do not think oral histories have to be translated because there are bilingual researchers out there. Just because I don't speak Cantonese, doesn't mean everything in Cantonese should be translated into English. So, sorry, thought I should put my own personal bias out there. What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Chu?
Our oral histories with the State Library have been fully translated, but that is quite a painstaking process. It takes probably 5 or 6 times the amount of time to do the translations, do the transcripts and do the translations, in addition to doing the interview. I think a probably compromised approach would be for the bilingual oral historian to provide a detailed, summarized account of the interview with names and places and dates in both languages. It'll be
So a
easy to
bilingual
reconcile.
log of, yeah, that sounds much more reasonable, because otherwise I think if you've got to translate everything, it makes the bar so much higher. And, you know, undertaking an oral history is a time-consuming documenting method to start with. And I think oral history is fabulous. So putting an even higher bar makes it challenging. And I also like the way you really highlighted that by not allowing people to kind of be recorded in both languages, you'd be missing information, like the woman who started her journey in Cantonese and ended her journey in English, just as a natural thing, or people referencing various family stories using phrases in other languages. Yes, I think there are, yeah. Okay, what recommendations do you have for libraries that have limited funds and staff time? A complex one to ask. It's, yeah, one of the questions that's come through the chat. It's fine if you.
I'm not from an accounting or finance background, so I may not be the best person to address this. But one thing I can suggest is that, in response to another question, and is that librarians could reach out to the community and see if they're interested in pursuing this joint venture or partnership initiative. And once there is enough support, do ask the senior management or leadership of your library and see if what can be done from there.
Or there may be community groups that would also be willing to partner with funding costs as well. No, that's a good suggestion.
And it could be also a volunteer or a leisure time activity for those who are interested in preserving their own community. But probably the library would have better long-term storage other than putting in the back of somebody's shed at home or whatever.
Yes, particularly with a range of kind of storage devices. I loved your account of recording your uncle on the bus. I think that sounds a very special recording to have. There's a question around, is there a software which can do translations? That's a complex one, Joe, because it's, you know, I'm going to say it's the amplify in multiple languages kind of question. So it's a complex one. Any further? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, with translation, transcription, with the improvement of technology, there are better software for transcribing. English is quite good. Cantonese is quite a strange language, so it's not so easy to do so. Mandarin is also, it's possible. So I guess in some languages it is possible to have transcription done. But one thing that should be done after it's transcribed by a machine is that somebody should read over it, preferably the oral historian, and look for places where things maybe the words may be off, like similar sounding words or abbreviations, for example, that they may not come across. And
maybe have a note that that's machine translation, etc., for indicative purposes, for exact, you know, research. You'll need to listen to the recording or some such, terminology like that. That could be one to consider. And for some of the oral history specific questions, we are having an oral history session later today as well, to keep in mind, but please keep the discussion going in chat. I think that's it for the questions. I'll give people 30 seconds to quickly type anything else No, that's terrific. Thank you again. That was joyful. And I think you've got a lot of people really thinking about the importance of bilingual oral histories as part of their local studies collection. So thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today.
Can I say a few words? I'll leave my email in the chat, and I'll also link it to a few resources that may be helpful. If you need any more help, or do feel free to contact me.
Thank you very much. That's very kind.
Yeah.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Chu. Okay, we'll now we have Robin Hamilton from the State Library of Queensland talking about some contemporary collecting they're undertaking around the culturally and linguistically diverse people of Queensland. Over to you, Robin.
Hello, everybody. Can you all hear me? Hopefully, yes. Hi, I'm Robin Hamilton, and my team is the collection, building and interpretation team at the State Library, in part of the John Oxley Library, which is the Queensland Heritage section of State Library. Today, State Library, where I am today, is in Meanjin on Turrbal and Yagara country, and Kurulpa Point, which I'm looking at right now, is situated right here where State Library is, and it's been a meeting and gathering place for thousands of years. So I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country and pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. So yes, indeed, I'm here to just talk a little bit about collecting culturally and linguistically diverse material. It's certainly one of our collecting priorities here at State Library. So my team's job is we're the acquisitions team. So we acquire material which broadly reflects the history of Queensland and its people, and we contribute to the Queensland's documentary record. And to that end, we're governed by a content strategy and collecting guidelines and collecting priorities, which we review each year. So culturally and linguistically diverse material is certainly a priority. Now I'm going to attempt to share some photos while I'm talking, just photos from our collection, which might give you an idea of the thoughts of one way in which we document Queensland's diverse communities here at State Library. So let's have a little look. So why is it important to collect culturally and linguistically diverse material? Dr. Chu's provided some really wonderful reasons why. For the John Oxley Library, like many heritage institutions in Australia and around the world, it was founded a long time ago, and the origins of the collection are white and male and English speaking, a very colonial start. So our clear collecting intention is to broaden and deepen the collection beyond that origin to much better reflect Queensland society, both historically and today. So greater diversity and inclusion is most definitely the goal, so that we can uncover those so far untold stories and hidden histories, and more honestly and faithfully represent Queensland and its people. So at this point, I'd just like to acknowledge that culturally and linguistically diverse material in the John Oxley Library is really quite patchy, and we have a long, long way to go to qualify as a well-rounded collection. So for us, this really is an aspirational priority. And I'd also like to say that as a staff, we're actually not very good at collecting this material, and that in no way discounts anyone's professional capability or experiences, but it just acknowledges that there are those extra challenges for us in collecting well in this area, and we're still learning. For instance, none of my team speak a language other than English, and none of us have deep familial connections to non-English speaking communities. So we have to develop those relationships. And often it's a case of we simply don't know what we don't know, or rather we don't know who we don't know. So we're outsiders looking in at this point, and so we're learning how to do this better. So where does that leave us, and how do we proceed? How might we start conversations and forge relationships with the collection building aim in mind? So for starters, for us, we found it useful to sit down and ask a series of questions. One is, go back to your content strategy. What's your library's brief? What's the intention, expressed intention behind collecting culturally diverse material? And then what are your particular demographics? Are there distinct cultural groups within your broader community, and how do you access them? What do they do and where do they gather? And this could involve all sorts of things. It could involve places of worship, community centres, radio stations, conversation classes, language institutes, business precincts, or it could just be over the back fence at your neighbour's house. So what are the cultural pastimes which are common to all of us and common to these and particular to these to various communities in your area? I'm actually noticing with these slides I seem to have a food and dancing theme going on inadvertently, but there you are. So here's a good one. Does your community or council have a calendar or a directory of multicultural events and organisations which you can easily access? And so are there organisations or associations that represent your diverse communities? If there are, and indeed there will be, is it better to approach an umbrella organisation such as Multicultural Australia or the Ethnic Communities Council, or to start more local and specific with individual associations and community groups? Essentially, I think starting local is the way to go. Who do you already know or know of, and who has a story to tell? A couple of points to note here, which we've found important to keep in mind. And one is to make sure you understand and respectfully observe community protocols. Are there protocols around initiating a relationship with a community or an organisation? Is a formal approach preferred? And to whom? Elders or community leaders or an association committee chair, perhaps? So that's something to keep in mind. And I think probably the most important one for me is invest the time to build a genuine relationship. Rushing into a conversation about acquiring material might be a bit confronting and inappropriate and might feel a bit disingenuous. So take the time to actually form the relationship. If a community, on the other hand, though, has approached you, that's different. But it is still worth, in our experience, taking the time to make sure everybody's of the same understanding as you proceed. Another thing I think is good to keep in mind is to make sure you treat each diverse community as its own opportunity. Different community groups will be different, very different indeed. Called is not a catch-all, and forming a relationship with or acquiring a collection from one community doesn't really mean that you've covered all your options at all by any stretch. And I guess something else we've discovered is that not every community is necessarily a record-keeping culture. Some cultures follow a more oral tradition, and others may just not have had the opportunity yet to generate much by way of documentary material. And it may not have occurred to some communities or people that a library might be interested in collecting and preserving their records or documenting their experiences. So collecting might differ and look different considerably from one cultural group to the next. So I've just posed some questions, talked about why, and then posed some questions around how. But let's talk about what. What might you collect? What do you want to collect to represent the communities in your area? What records or stories are important to a community? I think that's the more important question. Might a community wish to share? How have members of a community documented their experiences so far? And depending on how they've migrated to Australia, some of their stories might be confronting or traumatic. So for us, we would be looking for their cues as to how they wish to be represented. But the sorts of things you might collect are newsletters, newspapers, published works, photographs, as we're collecting here and there, objects, oral histories for sure. But other video diaries as well, creative writing and poetry, artworks, it could be anything. At State Library, we're lucky enough to have the capacity to commission content. The photos that you're seeing right now are examples of that. And we also do oral histories and digital stories. And they document the diverse communities of Queensland. But I think it's an important point to make is that it's important to seek out community-created content as well. It's one thing to collect material about or generate material or commission material about a community, but it's equally, if not more important, to seek material generated by a community. So how are we going for time? I think I just wanted to give you one little example of something which worked well for State Library over the last number of years. Every year, State Library awards fellowships here at State Library Queensland, and in 2016, the Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame fellowship recipient was Dr. Toni Risson with a project about the history of Greek cafes in Queensland. Her research spawned a book, but it also in 2020 spawned an exhibition called Meet Me at the Paragon, the Greek Cafe Phenomenon. And this exhibition then triggered some ongoing engagement with Queensland's Greek community, which resulted in some wonderful donated collections, in particular oral histories. And so this was a great example of sustained investment in a relationship with a particular community and that community's continued involvement with State Library across a number of different kinds of programming. And the result was just for all of us was an altogether lovely, deeper understanding of one of Queensland's really significant migrant communities. So I might, depending on how we're going, I'll stop the share and see how we're going. I think we're just at the 10-minute mark. I'll give you one more example quickly of something similar, along similar lines, which is happening right now. So our two current honorary fellows, Dr. Amy Kim and Dr. Aaron Teo, are investigating the history of Asian Australian eateries and migration policies in Queensland. That's their project. And so we're going to support them by commissioning some oral history interviews with notable restaurant owners in Brisbane. And, you know, that's just decades of history right there, and not represented at all in our collection to date. So we're excited about that. So thanks, everyone. I think let me look at the chat. Let's see if there are any.
That sounds fabulous. So it'd be great if people could ask questions for Robin. I have to admit, there's, you know, you've been one of the Queensland restaurants has been immortalised in Jennifer Wong's Chopsticks or Fork. So great
Yes.
to hear that other kinds of collecting is being undertaken. Thank you for highlighting the challenges, but also that it is about planning, building the relationships rather than going, it's too difficult to start. But also that look at your collection plan. Yes, massive fan of looking at that. Any questions for, okay, question, how did you reach out to the communities to gather these photos? Now, I think you mentioned you commissioned them, didn't you?
We do, and we're lucky enough to be able to do that. So we have a couple of, or quite a number of regular photographers with whom we work. Some of them have connections to the community. As Dr. Chu was saying, it's that kind of middle person. So we, in I guess, engaging a photographer to do work for us, that person will then make an approach to whoever the organizer of an event is, or and make sure they have permission to take photographs. Often we're photographing public events, but all the permissions are in place, and generally there's tremendous support for that. People are really happy to be documented in that way, and we're delighted to then make them part of the documentary record. So
that sounds terrific, and sounds like a lot of things. People are kind of, looks like they're feeling inspired, getting some ideas to follow up. It'll be interesting to see who, you know, has already looked at their collection plan to see what needs updating. Yes. Any further questions for Robin at this stage?
I guess I could make one more point and say that it's often quite a circular thing, that you might start with sometimes a collection then spawns some kind of engagement or programming or exhibition, something like that. But sometimes it can happen the other way around, where some kind of community, and starting with a community engagement activity, can then sometimes result in a collection option. So it's good to think about it as a circle.
Sounds an excellent way of thinking about it, and a very positive way too. Thank you so much, Robin. And thank you for sharing the work that the State Library of Queensland's doing in that space, including that it's an ongoing challenge for it, but certainly you're getting some fabulous collection items to help tell the story of Queenslanders.
Thanks very much.
So yes, please join with me in thanking Robin. It's still always a bit awkward how you do that online, isn't it? But there's a lot of thank yous coming through chat. Now we're going to hear from Andrew Allen. He's a local studies librarian in Campbelltown Library in Western Sydney. And I'll hand over to Andrew.
Thank you, Ellen. I'll just share my screen with everyone. Hopefully you can all see this.
We can. It's not in full screen mode, though.
Yeah, just about to do that. Just about to. Okay. How are we going with that?
Looks great. Thank you.
Okay. So hi, everyone. My name's Andrew Allen. I'm the local studies librarian at Campbelltown Library. And today I'd like to talk about my experience of collecting multicultural oral histories at Campbelltown Library. We're a library in Sydney Southwest. So Campbelltown Library realised that although our oral history collection was considerable and growing, we lacked recordings that reflected the area's growing multicultural population. So more than 28% of Campbelltown's residents are born overseas, with an increasing proportion of the community speaking a language other than English. The figure of 28% is predicted to rise rapidly in coming years as more and more migrants look to acquire land at affordable prices in Sydney's rapidly growing southwest. And this is a table that shows Campbelltown's ancestry ranked by size. So as you can see, it compares figures between 2016 and 2021. And it shows a significant rise in groups such as Chinese, Filipino, Samoan, but in particular, Bengali. That's one language that is really rising. I can't explain why there's an Aboriginal rise so high so quickly, but I guess that's for another discussion. At our library, for example, we cater for our growing multicultural population with things like leaflets in languages other than English. We run English conversation classes. And of course, we have a comprehensive collection of community language materials. But in relation to oral histories, my way of past thinking was that we must capture residents that have lived in Campbelltown all or most of their lives and capture their stories before they pass. So, of course, this is important, but it shouldn't be the be-all and end-all for oral history collecting. Collecting resident stories from different cultural backgrounds is also a crucial component to any library's collection. As you can see from this slide, almost all these people on our main oral histories page are elderly and come from Anglo-Australian backgrounds. But two projects we implemented in recent years have somewhat changed our oral history collection and have separate links on the library's webpage, and I'll discuss these shortly. Curators in Australia have long stressed the need to move away from one-sided perspectives and portray diverse experiences, including immigrants and minority voices. Across library and museum collections in Australia, there's a lack of oral history sound recordings in community language. Generally speaking, there are a few exceptions, including a few Sydney metropolitan libraries. And this slide here shows one of those libraries. It's Fairfield, again in Sydney's southwest. But it shows the commitment Fairfield City Library Services made to collecting interviews from many cultural backgrounds. And I think they've been doing this since 2000. They've been collecting interviews with community members from many different backgrounds, including Assyrians, Lao, Italian, Polish, Spanish, Vietnamese. So it's a very multicultural area of Fairfield, and they've done an amazing job. But I also want to stress that they're just one of a number of libraries that are actually collecting a lot of community language into oral histories. Oral history projects which focus on underdocumented, minoritized or marginalized individual groups or communities commonly stake their value on the claim that such projects can work to fill the gaps in the national story, contribute to a more complete historical record, or recover lost, overlooked or hidden histories. Oral projects in Australia have for too long reflected English as the dominant language. And as a result, the voices and experience of non-English speakers have not always been documented. It's worth noting that those who are least likely to be fluent in English tend to be first-generation immigrants. Not so surprisingly, in Australia's oral history collection, there remains a conspicuous lack of first-generation migrant voices. And this is the sort of thing that Dr. Chu was talking about earlier. If these settler perspectives are not recorded either by themselves or their families, their memories as immigrants may never be captured. So by the time we reach the third or fourth generations, they will be fully assimilated Australians, wondering where their ancestors came from and what their early years in Australia were like. Therefore, our library, and all libraries for that matter, have a big responsibility in collecting these stories that second and later generations of these families can't. It's something that I'm aware of for future multicultural oral histories that we do here. Our library's collection of multicultural oral histories originated with a project supported by the State Library of New South Wales that began in 2016. And after that, another State Library of New South Wales backed project we called Giving a Voice. Before I talk about that, I just wanted to run through a few tips from my experience. For both projects, all of these people were happy to relive experiences, so don't feel you have to avoid difficult subjects. Don't be put off by possible emotional reactions or other negative responses to your requests for interviews. Another tip is I send questions to participants first. It helped them understand and prepare. But like all oral histories, don't just stick to these questions. Try and make it a conversation. Do your research as much as possible. Be prepared for emotional responses. One interviewee that we had the pleasure of talking to was a South Sudan migrant, and he talked about his family and how he lost a lot of them in the war, and it was a really, really emotional experience. So be prepared for that. We did transcribe each interview. We're lucky enough to have a volunteer that comes in and does a lot of transcriptions. So that was just something that we do. It can be difficult when trying to understand accents, but do your best. It's okay to contact later for clarification. And you need to be aware of cultural rules. I mean, that goes without saying. Don't shake hands with Muslim women, which I did once. So I found out the hard way. Eye contact it can also be a factor, but again, don't let any of this put you off. So it's important to remember that these interviews capture feelings of what it was like to move to a new country and a new area like Campbelltown. Look, they tell of trauma and triumph, adversity and adaptation, maintaining traditional cultures and becoming Australian. And remember that current or recent thoughts are raw. So if you can interview someone who has recently arrived, then that's even better. Some common things I noticed: all interviewees remained positive, which was really uplifting. This was the case despite the struggles and often trauma they have been through. Another thing I noticed was all or most missed friends and family enormously, which is quite understandable. They all felt sad about their home countries and the huge problems their countries face that they have left behind. Most still have relatives there. And I think about how I would feel in the same situation, and I know I'd be no different. So I'd like to introduce you quickly to some of the people featured in our collection of multicultural oral histories. The first one is a friend of mine, actually, called Sikandar Khan. He was born in Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, and followed his brother to Australia to continue his education after the death of his father and mother. The thing he misses most are his friends and family, something that is common to all our interviewees. He could speak some English, but the accent was really hard to understand. Again, quite common. Compared to Bangladesh and other overpopulated countries, Sikandar loves the slower paced life of Australia, Campbelltown in particular. His only concern is the likelihood that the population will increase. Probably never like Bangladesh's population, though, I hope. The next person is Fatin Al-Rawi. She was really, really interesting. She was born in Baghdad and told the story of how her family left war-torn Iraq and for Fatin and her husband to finish their studies. She completed her master's in engineering and her husband his PhD in Malaysia before applying everywhere in the world for a job. Fatin was separated from her husband for 2 years, so it's unimaginable how difficult this was for her and her children. I can't imagine that. As the tensions in Iraq continued and her fears for her kids' safety grew, an opportunity with the UTS, University of Technology Sydney, presented itself to move to Australia. This was in 2001, the same year as 9/11, so ill feeling towards Muslims was high at that time. Hearing that there were many Muslims, he comforted her, and you often get surprised with interviews like this. She said that she didn't hate Saddam Hussein. Some of her family did, but she explained that he did do some good for the country. So you learn a lot from these interviews. Malouche was a real character. He came to Australia from war-torn South Sudan, and sadly, like hundreds of other children in the area, he contracted meningitis and lost much of his hearing. But he remained very positive despite the obstacles he needed to overcome. As I explained earlier, members of his family were killed, which he obviously couldn't talk about. He was difficult to understand because of his deafness and his accent, so it required patience and often repeating questions. But again, try not to let this put you off, because the end result is so rewarding. So the other project was at the State Library of New South Wales, when they provided library and other participating libraries with portable oral history recording kits and training to capture under-collected information from Aboriginal and Kaurl communities. They were two examples of under-related information. The recordings offer a fascinating insight into the lives of these long-standing Campbelltown residents and highlight the many wonderful things about living in our community, while also acknowledging the challenges that they have faced with the prevalence of racism and prejudice in our society. Each person had a really uplifting story that demonstrates their determination and desire to make a significant contribution to the Campbelltown community. 3 First Nations people were interviewed, and that was rewarding. However, the project also included 2 of Campbelltown's multicultural community. And these interviews included Brian Lal, who was an amazing guy. He sleeps 3 hours a night, so anyone who sleeps 3 hours a night, I'm pretty impressed with. And to do what he does on that little amount of sleep. He was born in what is now Chennai in South India and went to university and had a distinguished career as a journalist, interviewing the likes of Mother Teresa and Muhammad Ali, among others. And this kind of made him easier to interview because of his experience in interviewing. Initially visiting Australia for a fun trip, he and his family moved here in 1997. So whenever he sees a community need, he's right onto it. And he became Citizen of the Year in 2023. So another amazing achiever, but not so much a refugee, but a great success story of making it good here and integration with the community. This lady will probably be familiar to most of you, Rosemary Kariuki. She grew up in the Usain Gishu district of the Rift Valley in East Africa. Rosemary cared for the youngest group of 16 of her father's children when he suddenly passed away while the others worked the farm, and she was only 10. Rosemary believed for the longest time that you can't talk bad of adults, and that finally changed in 2007 when she did the documentary, The Borkum Hill African Ladies Trip. Rosemary's indomitable spirit shines through in this remarkable interview. She is a remarkable person. And finally, I thought I would include Jessica Sue Tang. Jessica's a transgender person. And although the purpose of Jessica's interview was for Pride Month, her interview touched on subjects related to her Chinese background. She talks about how her Chinese family reacted to her sexuality. That was really interesting to listen to. So in summing up, we need to think about how our oral history methodology is used in the library and how rethinking this use may find pathways towards genuine inclusion and a more authentic representation of our complex and richly diverse society. I believe our oral history collections should be adaptive and reflective of the changing world from which they are developed. And lastly, most of our interviewees have expressed their gratitude to us for interviewing them and giving them a chance to tell their story. And this again demonstrates the important role libraries, including Campbelltown, play in collecting these important stories and for the contribution they make to our local but national history. So thank you for listening to my presentation.
So much, Andrew. It was fabulous to hear the accounts of the different people, and it certainly sounds like you're doing a great job collecting. We've got a couple of questions, but they're going to need a short answer. How did you make contact with the people?
Some of them were different methods. Sometimes they would come into the library and I would get familiar with them that way, and I would explain that we were looking to do like the projects that we're doing. So sometimes I would be recommended a person, contacts or friends would recommend someone to me. So different kind of ways that we got onto these people.
That sounds good. And any tips for when emotional responses occur?
That's a good question. All you can do really is be empathetic. Give them time to get it out. It's important to explain at the start that we can edit interviewees and explain that we can stop and start again. But just be empathetic towards their situation, but it's not easy, and there are times where I find myself getting emotional too, so I have to sort of stop and take a breath. That has happened, so but it's tough.
But it sounds like the interviews have been very powerful. They have. Not shying away from tough topics seems to be an important statement that's coming through.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, they're really, in most cases, happy to talk about this because it's someone listening to them, which they don't often have happen.
Please join me with thanking Andrew and thanking also Robin and Dr. Chu. This has been a great start to the day. We'll now be having a 10-minute break. There is a 30-minute break after the oral history session. Andrew will look at the questions in chat after the break and will choose to answer any additional ones there, if that's okay, Andrew.
That's fine.
But see you back in 10 minutes time. That's at 12:25, 11:55 or 10:25, depending on where you are.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome back to the Wider Local Studies Seminar Day 1. Thank you so much for your curiosity and your insightful comments this morning. We're going to move on to our next and final session before lunch now, which is a special interest of mine, continuing in on our oral history themes. I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name's Nicole Hilda. I'm the Heritage Librarian with Hobsons Bay Libraries. I'm a member of the Wider Local Studies Planning Committee, and I'm on Bunurong land here today as part of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to traditional owners and any First Nations people joining us today. I'd like just to do a quick visual description, which is just a short description of myself and my surroundings, which I believe can make the session more accessible and inclusive. So I'm a white woman with shoulder length light brown hair and blue eyes. I'm wearing glasses, silver dangly earrings, and a white and black striped jumper. I'm working from home today, so you might be able to see my balcony and a bit of rain in the background there. So before I introduce our wonderful next speaker, just a reminder that we're using the hashtag Wider Local Studies. So if you'd like to include that in any social media posts you're doing, that would be a wonderful way to keep the conversation going. Okay, so for this session, the planning committee really wanted to highlight some international long-running projects. And we're really thrilled to have Rosie Stather here today. Rosie is the Oral History and Content Digitisation Specialist from Invercargill Archives in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And she's going to talk today about the Southland Oral History Project. Welcome, Rosie. I'm just going to get your PowerPoint slide up.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you perfect. Yeah.
Very good.
Okay. Okay, so the floor is yours. Take it away.
Okay, kia ora and welcome. So I'm the coordinator of the Southland Oral History Project. Ngā Paki Wātara tuku iho o Murihiko. First of all, I'd like to make a greeting. So tēnā koutou, kua hui hui mai nei, I mihi ana ki ngā mana whenua, ko wai hopai ahau, ki Invercargill City Council, no reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings everyone gathered here. I acknowledge the people of the land. I am from Invercargill, for Invercargill City Council, so greetings to you all. Okay, if I could have the next slide, please. Oh, okay, next one, sorry. Thank you. So I thought it would be helpful to start the presentation today by just giving you a little bit of context about Southland to give you some idea about where the project is based. So Southland is mainland New Zealand's southernmost region. It covers nearly 33,000 square kilometres and also includes Stewart Island, which is 20 kilometres off the southern coast. There's an estimated population of nearly 104,000, which represents 2% of New Zealand's population. So not a lot. We are a very top-heavy country with the majority of the population residing in the North Island and the north of the North Island around the Auckland area. So Southland is New Zealand's second most sparsely populated region. And I'll talk a bit more about the challenges that presents the project towards the end of my talk. Next slide, please. So the mission of the project is to capture and safeguard the stories of Southland and its people through the medium of recorded oral histories. So first of all, I'm going to give you a little bit of background. If you could do the next slide, please, about how the project started. So we've been going since 2006. At this time, there was some huge changes happening in the rural sector. Southland is a very rural, farming-orientated area, and there was a massive change from sheep farming and cropping to large-scale dairying. And this was having a massive impact on the population. There was major depopulation going on of the country, and there was a real change in the kind of social fabric. So Southland Rural Heritage Trust were very concerned that stories of Southland's rural traditions were going to be lost, and this kind of way of life that had been going from the 1920s through to the 1950s, people were becoming older and those stories were going to be lost. There had been smaller groups around the region that were doing some recording, but it was quite ad hoc. And obviously they were using the technology that was available at the time and using cassette recorders. Next slide. So there was a real need to preserve both the material that had been captured by getting it digitized and also proactively collecting more material going forward. So the age and health of key people gave an urgency to capturing these stories. It was really important for the project that everybody in the region felt involved. So a steering group was formed, formed of people from GLAM organisations around the region. So a lot of regional museums, local libraries. Our region is actually controlled by 3 different councils. So there's Invercargill City Council, where I'm based, Southland District Council and Gore District Council. So that adds an extra layer of complexity. So the project was set up as a joint venture between Heritage South as a heritage trust and the council. We got our home here at the Invercargill City Libraries and Archives, and we set about training a team of interviewers to go out and capture material. This was done in conjunction with NOHANS, which is the New Zealand Oral History Association. And pivotally, we got a lot of input from a local Dunedin oral historian, Helen Frizzell. We thought it was really important that we started off doing things right, setting a great framework for things going forwards. We also wanted the best ethical framework that we could have. And again, we used NOHAND guidances as to how we should be going about setting things up. We felt it was important that we used the best possible recording equipment we could. So we purchased state-of-the-art equipment of the time so that we could future-proof recordings, make sure that they were of a good archival quality. And then we recognised a need early on, obviously, for there to be a catalogue so we could have a record of what we were recording. Okay, next slide. So the project aims to record as many stories as possible from people who are either born in Southland or who have moved here at some point in their lives. The project now holds over 600 recordings, and we also have a lot of photographs and other documents that accompany those. We do a lot of looking backwards, obviously interviewing people, older people, about their lives, and our particular strength is from the Depression through the Second World War and onwards. But we do also capture contemporary material. So we have a collection of recordings that were done to celebrate women's suffrage. And we also have a collection of recordings that looked back at 25 years on from some severe flooding that happened in the Invercargill region in 1984. Okay, next slide. So what are the recordings used for? So they are obviously precious memories for families, and I get a lot of requests from families who would like a copy of their recordings. Often people will be doing family history research, and they'll do a search and they'll find that we hold a recording, and in many instances the family didn't know that the recording existed. So that's a very nice part of the project is giving those recordings to families. Family history research, local history research. They're used for books, presentations, museum exhibits. We do a lot of work with local schools. Our recordings have been used for linguistic analysis. You can't hear it with me because I'm not a local to Southland, but Southlanders do have quite a distinctive accent with a very rolling R. And there was a study done by the University of Canterbury, and they were able to use our recordings, which is one of the reasons why we're so proud of the quality of the recordings that we make. And obviously, I do a lot of presenting to local groups and I'm involved in heritage events. Next slide. So how do people find what's in the collection? So we've got an online catalogue, which can be found at the Invercargill City Library website. Sorry, I need to slow down a bit so I don't garble my words. It's very simple to search. You can search on names, subjects, keywords, and on there you can read the abstracts of many recordings. For those of you who are not familiar, abstracts are time-coded index, which provide quick access to the content of recordings. You can view photographs, and to further enrich the online experience, we are making audio extracts available online as well. Okay. So it's also, sorry, I forgot to mention that you can listen to the material by coming into the public library and listening to them in our research room, but we can also provide remote access. It's fairly basic and it works very much on a trust basis. We do provide copies to families, and we're also working with museums and other institutions around the Southland region so that they can hold the material to make it easier for people to access. So it's really, really important for me to stress that the success of our project depends so much on our volunteers. And this is a group of volunteers. This was taken at a get-together just before Christmas last year. They do the bulk of the interviewing, they do the abstracting, and they also help out with cataloguing. So without them, the project would not be able to go forward in terms of adding content. Okay. So we provide training to groups around Southland as and when it's required. I've actually got training in Gore, which is Eastern Southland, on this coming Sunday. We've got a group of about 15 new people coming to do some training then. The training's given by myself and a local oral historian. We've cut the training down to one day to make it less of a commitment to people, because we've found that volunteers are becoming more and more time poor. So the easier we can make it for people to get involved, the better. It is quite intensive, but we do follow it up with a lot of one-on-one support through use of the equipment and then feedback on the interviews. And we have regular get-togethers, and I'm always available online and on the phone and in person to deal with any issues. Abstracting it doesn't take quite so much work to do, so I just do training one-on-one or to small groups as that's needed. And I often find that when people have done interview training, some of them may find that they don't actually like the idea of sitting and interviewing people. They're not confident with the questioning, or they find the equipment side of things tricky. So abstracting is often quite a good way for them to be involved with the project without having to do the interviewing. Okay, next slide. So some of the challenges that face our project. First and foremost, we've got a very large area to cover. It's quite easy sometimes when I'm based here in Invercargill and I'm dealing with our local interviewers and we're going out and about in Invercargill doing interviews, to forget that we are a Southland-wide project, and it's really, really important that we cover all the whole region. When you look at our collection, we've actually done quite well. I did an assessment a few months ago, and there's not many regions that we don't have at least some material from. We need to decentralise interview collection and access. So really want to get hubs of interviewers who support each other out in the regional centres, to identify the people in their areas who should be interviewed and to support each other, and also to help with access, as I said, trying to get more of the interviews out into local libraries and museums so that it's easier for people to listen to them. We are very reliant on our volunteers, and we do have big issues with retention, so we have quite a high turnover. Our interviewers tend to be older. They do struggle at times with the technical issues of using the equipment, and there's also variability in quality. We do see there is a lot of variation if you were to listen to material, depending on who's done it and the amount of experience. We also struggle a little bit with promoting awareness of the project, what we do, and getting people to use the material. It's all very well to say, well, we've got 600 odd interviews in the project, but those interviews need to be used by people doing research, family history research in schools for their history curriculum. And for that, we do acknowledge that we very much need an improved online presence. The catalogue is very basic. It's not very engaging, especially for the younger generation. It needs to be integrated better into other resources like our archives and our library catalogue, so that people can navigate around through the various materials that we hold. And one of our last kind of issues that we've got is supporting involvement with local Maori. We have come a long way with this in the last kind of 2 or 3 years, where we've begun to, we've realised that we do hold quite a few Māori recordings within the collection, but often we have a lot more success by working alongside Māori groups. So we've been involved with a local women's group where they're interviewing some of their older kaumātua. We've provided them with training, we've provided them with access to the equipment. At some point, we may have the recordings lodged with us. They may be under slightly different access arrangements. We had another arrangement recently with a group who were doing interviews about the early history of Ruapuki Island. Again, we went to the marae at Bluff and provided some training. We gave them access to the recording equipment and support. They've done their interviews. We're not entirely certain what's going to happen with those interviews in terms of where they will end up being archived. It would be lovely if they come to us, but the main thing for us is they get created and then they may get lodged with the Ngāi Tahu archives up in Christchurch. So we're beginning to realise that working alongside is sometimes a better approach. Right, now I think I'm going a little bit over time, but what I really wanted to be able to do was for you to be able to listen to some of our recordings, so we'll get straight on to that. So if we go to the next slide. So I've got sort of 4 excerpts for you to listen to. The first 2 look back at life in the 20s and 30s. So the first one is from Jack, who was born near the small eastern Southland town of Edendale. Jack was a farmer and he served in World War II in Italy. And in this excerpt, he's talking about how he got to school.
How did you get to school?
I rode a pony, yes, with my brother. And we done that for 3 years. And then we got a horse and cart. And there was 10 of us in the cart. 4 of us, 4 of the neighbours, and 2 more. And that's how they all finished school, right up to the 30s.
So the next excerpt is from Thelma. Thelma was born in the small northern Southland town of Lumsden. She spent her life being involved in farming, her family and her community. And in this excerpt, she's talking about her first school experiences.
And with Lumsden, in the early days, they didn't have a school. They had a few children, and the parents got together with some children and they started a school on the top story of the loft at the elbow stables with a teacher. But they found that wasn't very satisfactory because there was too much rough language coming from down below. So they thought they'd have to shift that, which they did. They went to a house somewhere near the Presbyterian Church. And finally they went along to the schoolmaster's, the station master's residence. And then they were allocated an allowance, or they had fundraised, and they had £947.50 to call tenders for a school, which they did.
That would be a lot of money in those days.
Well, it does. It doesn't sound much now, but it must have been. So the first school was started then.
Okay, if you want to go to the next slide, thanks, Nicole. So these two interviews come from a collection that were done 25 years after some serious flooding in 1984. The first is from Anne. She was interviewed in her involvement with about her involvement with civil defence, and she's talking about kind of the very human side of what happens during an event such as the floods.
You know, I can still see the face of a young mother who came up to me one day. We had given orders that everything in homes that had been completely flooded, that everything had to be thrown out, everything. And she had a little boy who had a wee teddy bear, and he wouldn't go to sleep without it. And they'd rescued this teddy bear. And of course, it had been in the floodwaters, storage. And she said to me, can I wash it? Because he won't go to sleep without it. And I had to say no. I felt dreadful. But if that kid had chewed on it and, got sick, that would have been my fault. And she cried.
You'd feel like crying too.
I did.
Yes.
I did feel like crying.
Yes.
But those are the sorts of emotions that you remember.
Yes.
Apologies if you heard that alarm go off. That was my 20-minute alarm. Anyway, the last excerpt we're going to play is from Graham, who was also involved in the flood response through his interest in CB radio. And he's talking about the aftermath of the floods.
Sorry.
In a fortnight later, when things had gradually coming right, the disaster was really having an impact on everybody that couldn't get into the houses. Now you know what the Christchurch people felt like with their earthquake. They just had nowhere to go. They couldn't get back in their houses. A lot of people were out of their houses for nearly a year by the time they got builders in to fix them all, and they had to wait 3 months for the houses to dry out. I think it was a minimum of 3 months, and the building inspectors had to go around and check that the dampness was fully dry, or the houses were fully dry, and ascertain how much repairs were needed, and time you got builders and blah, blah, blah. It goes on.
So I hope, that's just obviously a very small selection of material from the collection, but I hope it gives you an idea of some of the material that we hold.
Thanks, Rosie. That was so interesting to hear. I was really interested to hear about your acknowledgement and efforts just moving towards building more engagement with the audio. Are you doing that through kind of the social media, or thinking of doing a podcast? What are you thinking? How are you thinking of doing that?
Well, we do, yeah. So I do presentation to groups and I go into schools. We use any opportunity we can to get into the local media. So we had a newspaper reporter came and interviewed me around Anzac Day to talk about veteran stories. And we have done some podcasts. That was through the library. We did a series of podcasts about lots of things to do with the library, and 3 of those were on the oral history. Done exhibitions. Oral histories don't necessarily lend themselves to exhibitions, but where you can combine the visual stuff. So we do biographies and then photographs, and then use QR codes to excerpts on the SoundCloud so that people can listen to things and then look at that in conjunction with the pictures. It worked really well.
Yep. There's a few questions in the chat about training. Could you go into a little bit more about your process of how you train people to interview your volunteers?
Okay, well, so our training has been, as I say, it's been whittled down from a 2-day now to a 1-day course. We focus primarily on like the basics of a good interview and how to use the equipment confidently, the basis of the project, so that they understand the ethics of what they're involved with, and that the interviewers understand. Like, we do have quite a bit of paperwork, recording agreements, so that the interviewers understand how those need to be applied. Anything too tricky, obviously, I can help out with. So yeah, I mean, we focus very much on the interview techniques, but it is a once over lightly, and we do acknowledge that, but we listen to people's interviews and we give them feedback. So it's kind of continuous improvement. Some people get it really quickly. Some people struggle a little bit. The equipment can be a bit of an issue. So I see there was actually, talking of equipment, I see somebody's just popped something up there. Should we be thinking about video rather than audio? We get asked that a lot, actually, and we have tried. We had a lovely lady out on Stewart Island who was doing oral history recording, and she was very confident with equipment, and she recorded using video recording as well as audio. It does add a level of complexity, because then you're having to manage 2 pieces of equipment, because the audio on a video recorder is not good enough. In many instances where it's just a talking head, like looking at me on this screen, it's not very exciting and it doesn't add a lot. Whereas the ones that she did that worked really well was when they were active and they were like maybe moving around a building, looking at different things, or moving around a property, talking about stuff where you needed to see what was being referenced. But as a general rule, it doesn't really add a lot, and it also adds complexity when it comes to maintaining the collection, because the video file sizes are orders of magnitude larger than the oral history. You know, it's a lot, and our volunteers I don't think they would be very successful with video. It has a place, but I don't think it replaces it.
Yeah, it's a whole different kettle of fish, isn't it? Yeah.
It is.
I was also interested to hear your kind of shift in approach with the Maori community. And I think it sounds like there's been a real acknowledgement there of the power dynamics of oral history, and that you're moving towards, it sounds like, a more kind of creation model with them. We don't have a whole lot of time left, but would you be able to just go into that a little bit more? And it looks like also, if you're happy to do that, would you put your email in the chat? Because it looks like we're not going to be able to get to all the questions. people are asking if you're happy for people to contact you. Thanks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. More than happy. Yeah, it was interesting because we had a couple of members of the local Māori community were on the steering group when the project was started. And I think they were somewhat skeptical of it. I guess Māori have a very, very strong oral tradition.
Yeah.
This is how their whakapapa, their family stories are handed down. They also have quite strong views about how that material is shared. I guess it's like, you know, maybe for Pākehā, we might not mind everybody going on our ancestry site and seeing all about who we're related to and where we come from. But for Māori, there's, you know, you have to have permission to be able to know a lot of that information, and it's only shared within, you know, the iwi or families, the hapu. So yeah, we quickly learned when we were looking at it again for the 5-year plan for the project that we needed to be thinking about working alongside, and rather than expecting them to fit in with our way of doing things, which is a very European-centric view of oral history, that it was there were things that we could help with. The interviewing, the interviewing tips and tricks, the access to the equipment, the offer of archiving, if they felt that would be useful. It wasn't a question of, well, you either come in with us or we're not. You know, yeah, a parallel path is much more productive, I feel.
Okay, we've gone slightly over time, so unfortunately we've got to wrap it up. But thank you so much for joining us today, our first international guest, and congratulations on such a successful project, and thank you again for your time. Please stick around if you can for the rest of the seminar, but thank you on behalf of everyone. It was so interesting to hear.
My pleasure, and it was lovely to be asked. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, so next up we are going to go into an interview that I did with the director of the Queen's Memory Project. Natalie Milbrot was the founder of the Queen's Project, which kicked off a decade ago. This project has been really inspiring for the way that it deeply engages the community to be involved in oral history making. And yeah, I think it's a really interesting model for Australian libraries to be aware of. Because of the time difference, Natalie wasn't able to make it live on the seminar here, but she was generous enough to do a Zoom call with me about a month ago. So this is an edited version of that call. The interview goes for about 15 minutes, and after that we'll be going straight into our lunch break. And during the video, I'll be putting in some links into the chat to highlight and demonstrate some of the topics that Natalie is talking about. So I hope you will stick around.
And in terms of what Queen's Memory is, it's a community-led archiving project that uses post-custodial archiving methods and community-engaged approaches to democratizing the history-making process. So what we tried to do is engage people who live in Queens to help us make
Maybe try unsharing and then resharing, Nicole.
Really love how you've the emphasis on involving the community. Okay, so it sounds like pros for a lot of people. So I'm going to share my screen again and see how that goes.
What Queen's Memory is, it's a community-led archiving project that uses post-custodial archiving methods and community-engaged approaches to democratizing the history-making process. So what we try to do is engage people who live in Queens to help us make decisions about whose stories really need to be in the collections. So we encourage people to interview family members, teachers, neighbors, coworkers, people who they know have made contributions and who have had lives that plug into larger historical narratives, which is everyone. So what we try to do is provide support and education for anybody who wants to participate as a partner with us in that work. So we have lots of trainings for people who want to, for example, conduct an oral history interview. We also have lots of public programs where we try to raise awareness of personal digital archiving skills. We do scanning days. We have instructions for people so that they can go into any one of the 60 plus Queens Public Library locations and use the scanner that's just there, that's kind of standard equipment, but change the settings so that it can create archival quality scans of their materials and then show people, if they want to share them with the library's archives, how they can use our upload tools to be able to share those files with us along with metadata so that we can create catalog records and make them accessible.
Yeah, I really love how you've the emphasis on involving the community in the decision making and telling and sharing their own stories. Could you just talk about why you think that's important?
Sure. Well, so an interesting thing about this particular place, Queens, is that pre-1960s, it was really not the amazing kind of United Nations experiment, super diversity place that it is now. It really took immigration laws changing in the 1960s to bring in the populations that now make Queens a very unique place. I mean, it's the most diverse county in the United States, and some people say that it's the most diverse place in the world. I mean, I don't know about that, but it's definitely super diverse, and that's kind of what makes it special. But none of that history goes that far back. I mean, it really does start kind of in the 1960s. Before that, it was diverse, but there was also just a lot of, there were farms even. I mean, it really wasn't part of a dense urban place. It was much more suburban and sometimes on the edges, even rural. And there started in colonial times, there started being farms that were, Dutch and English farms in the 1600s. And of course, before that, the Tinicok and the Shinnecock and the Canarsie, there were a lot of indigenous people who were using the lands in really different ways than they're used now. The question about why to involve people, I mean, it's first of all just kind of impossible for any staff, no matter how much diversity exists within your staff, to be able to competently have the ability to interview people in all the languages where they would be most comfortable being interviewed, and Queens is not just an enormous place, but it's big enough that you can't be an expert on every neighborhood either. And so we really need to leverage the relationships and the local knowledge of people living across the borough. And what we know that we do have is expertise to be able to help them to, do the thing, like conduct a good interview or take a picture and gather enough metadata so that it will be useful to a future researcher. So we try to stay in our lane and then and just help people who really know the history and know the people to engage with us. And really, when we started Queen's Memory, the collections really did not reflect the diversity of the borough. And so my goal was always that especially a young person coming into the library's archives would be able to find themselves in the collections, and that they wouldn't just be faced with just, especially like a racial monolith of just all, pictures of white people doing things and think that that was Queens and that they just somehow weren't part of it. So I think that, the more we could make it representative of the collections, representative of the people, and have that be a mirror, the better we'll be serving people. And also, because it is a site of global migration, neighborhoods change really fast. So depending on what's going on in the world and who's coming in, I mean, you might have a neighborhood change very drastically in as little as 5 or 10 years. And so that's also part of it too, is that we just have to mobilize our ability to take a snapshot of a neighborhood and know that will not be how it is in a few years. So that really requires massive participation. A post-custodial approach to archiving is really moving away from the colonial construct of, taking people's stuff and making it safe, right? By removing it from communities who produce the records and putting them in a vault somewhere. So it's a way of keeping people, involved with their own papers and their own photographs and their own important objects, and finding ways to support those communities by creating digital surrogates of those things, and then keeping those, and those digital versions become the archival records that you're keeping. And the nice thing about this is that when you work directly with communities, then you can get much richer context and metadata about those records than you would get if you just extracted things and then tried in your archival processing room to figure out what it was that you had your hands on. So it's a way of working in partnership with communities, helping them to, the idea is that as a professional archivist, you have skills that are actually useful and knowledge that can actually help people to keep things safe, so you can have a conversation with a community member about, why an acid-free box? Like, why is that a better place to keep your stuff than a plastic, tub? And have conversations that are actually helpful to people so they can keep their own things. But then while you're there with them, really find out like what's happening in this picture and who are the people here and what year was this taken and who owns this and what can we do with it, and really having conversations about future use and licensing that are wonderful to have at the moment that you're with people, instead of trying to piece those details together later. Well, the actual audio or video file, we do not change unless somebody has something very specific that they need to have removed. So that is very rare that happens, but sometimes people will realize they've disclosed, personal medical information that they're like, whoops, I don't want that on the internet. Or like one woman was talking about her personal activism, and then she realized that she worked for a corporation where she had signed an agreement that she wouldn't mention their name along with her personal political activism. And so she was like, can you just take out all the places where I say the name of the company where I work? And so we took that out, and our practice is to then put in square brackets what the person had taken out. So not what the medical condition is, but that this person disclosed medical information or disclosed their employer and they couldn't do that. So we try to be forthright with our researchers about what things have been taken out and how many seconds it was that was taken out. And then where there's editing is really just in the transcript. So we will take out the ums and the, that kind of stuff in the transcript. But otherwise we keep everything unedited.
Great. And The project also really emphasises the importance of engaging with the collection once it's been catalogued, which I think is so important to do, because otherwise it's just going to sit there, and you've got to encourage people to interact with it and use it. Could you just maybe mention some of the ways that you've been able to do this?
Sure. And let me just say that this is an ongoing conversation with colleagues of mine who work with oral history. So both the International Oral History Association and also the North American Oral History Association. We're really talking about how people are not using the oral histories as much as we would like, and trying to weigh the value and cost, I guess, of the really expensive online hosting for just immediate access that all of us are doing with our oral history collections. I mean, we're just putting everything online and then finding that people are not necessarily accessing full interviews a whole lot. So this is kind of an open, weird issue that we're trying to work out. But what I would say is that the content that is listened to most is content that we have curated. And so that curatorial activity became an emphasis and to the tune of hiring people. So on the staff of the Queen's Memory Project, we populated the staff, one, with a full-time person who is a community outreach person, and then two, with a curator who is a part-time person, 20 hours a week, who is just responsible for curating content, because we know how important it is. And we know that a lot of people are only going to interact with Queen's Memory through Instagram, for example. I mean, we have Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, X, whatever, accounts, and there are thousands of people who follow us there, and I know that they will not necessarily ever come and listen to a full interview, but I think that it's still, it puts it in their mind what Queen's Memory is. And so then maybe when they want to interview grandma, like, we will come to mind as a resource that they can reach out to for help. Well, I think it sounds kind of administrative and maybe a little boring, but I think that there are some foundational activities where you really are setting the scope and parameters of the project that, if you do them on the front end, will really help you be a good partner going forward with community. When you can frame what it is that you're doing and be consistent about that, when you've thought ahead about things like what licensing the interviews are going to have, who owns them, I think that answering those big kind of like who's taking responsibility for what questions, I think is a great way to set up a really solid relationship of trust with people who then will come back and get other people involved, and you can really build from that foundation. And then I always think about the very first interview that we collected, that I collected to start the project, which was with, I was, trying to make inroads with my neighbors. And what I learned, which I think is just good to understand when you're doing engaged community work, is that there are these important people, kind of like gatekeepers to the community, people who everybody will breathe a sigh of relief once you've interviewed that person, because they know that that person is holding the jewels, they're holding all the stories. They know more than anybody else, and people love them. So there was this retired teacher who was in her 90s, and they were like, you need to interview Mrs. Christensen, and then after that we'll do interviews with you. So I was like, okay. So I sat down with her, and she, I think that I sat with her, I don't know, like 2 or 3 times, and she had so much energy and just had great stories for me. And by the time of our launch, so we had our first grant was a year-long grant, and by the time we had our party that was like the end of the grant, when we were doing a public launch of our website, she had already passed away. And so I invited her kids to come to that launch event, and I found them all just crowded around this laptop that we had set up as a listening station. And they told me that they realized that that was the only recording they had of their mom's voice. And so they were just all like sitting there together, just listening to her. And I realized at that moment that this project was going to potentially mean a lot to a lot of people, and that it was going to be really personal, not just to me, but to everybody who participated, and that everybody who was submitting an interview had family who it would mean a lot to them to hear it later. And I think that we don't have recordings of our loved ones' voices. So, which is so weird, but it's just the way it is. So I think that one really has always stuck with me as just this moment when I really knew what we were doing was important.
Okay, that's the end of the video interview with Natalie, and it's also the end of this oral history session. I think that was a really powerful way to end with that story of the impact that oral history collections can have. So thank you again to Natalie and Rosie for sharing with us two really inspiring projects. Okay, so we're going to move into a 40-minute break now, and we'll be back Eastern Standard Time at 1:55 p.m.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're back for the afternoon session today. My name is Michael Adams of the State Library of New South Wales. I'm coming to you today from my home, which I'd like to acknowledge is, was, and always will be Bidjigal land. So this afternoon we have a series of 10-minute talks with the themes of partnerships and programs. Before we get to our speakers, I just want to remind everyone who is attending tomorrow that it is a separate registration link. So I'm just going to share the link to join tomorrow, to register for tomorrow's session if you haven't already joined. But with that, we've got 5 great speakers, and we're starting with Joe Oliver from Wollongong City Libraries, who will be talking about partnering with local community groups to collect and make accessible local history. So give me one moment to share the slides for this afternoon, and then we will get into it. Okay, so do you want to take it away, Joe?
Thanks, Michael. Yes, thank you. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I come to you, the Dharawal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. In the local studies section of Wollongong City Libraries, we've found that connecting with local community groups has been a rich source of material for our collection. Some groups we've approached, some have approached us, and we've been connected to some through wider council projects. Forming partnerships with groups in the community has enhanced the exposure of local studies resources and led to ongoing connections, together helping to preserve and promote local history. We have existing fruitful relationships with Illawarra Historical Society and Illawarra Family History Group, but this presentation focuses on specific projects with other groups in our community. So next slide, thanks, Michael.
Sorry, one moment. Sorry.
Thanks. We became aware that we weren't collecting many contemporary images, and so we invited the Wollongong Camera Club to choose historic photos from our Illawarra Images library collection and take matching photos in present time, which were donated to the library. The photos were displayed in the library as pairs of matching images in 20 reusable frames and in an online exhibition titled Then and Now. Next slide, thanks. The local Country Women's Association approached council to help them celebrate their centenary. The library interviewed CWA members and put their interviews online in our existing oral history website called Illawarra Stories. The interviewees also donated photos to the local studies collection, and council organised to have some of the images displayed large in a walkway on one side of the central library, and they organised a celebratory opening of this exhibition, inviting the participants. Next slide, thanks. We approached some community organisations and some approached us to interview their members and preserve their photos, posters and ephemera. These have included Illawarra Grevillea Park, Men's Sheds, Illawarra Folk Festival. The council was also planning a new community centre and library in Warrawong, it required the demolition of the existing centre. We were invited to interview current users and document their activities. And some of the images and key statements made in the interviews will be included in the new building and preserved in the library's collection. Next slide, thanks. We've also conducted interviews with local surf club representatives and included them in Illawarra Stories. The interviews have also resulted in the donation of photos and memorabilia to the library. And we do put these photos with the interviews on our online site, as well as catalogue them and place them in our general collection. The next one. Council partnered with the Disability Trust to create a community mural with panels painted by young people connected with the Trust. And we became involved in the process of interviewing the participants, and their paintings were linked from the mural by QR code to their interviews on Illawarra Stories. Next slide, thanks. Council invited local Aboriginal poets to compose pieces responding to the Wollongong Botanic Gardens for the 50 years celebrations. Videos were made of the poets reciting their poems in situ. And the library hosts these videos on Illawarra Stories to make them accessible to the public for the future. And next one. Some community groups already have their own websites, including stories from their members and photos of their work. And we've developed positive relationships with these groups, and they've been very happy to give us permission to make links to their website from our Illawarra Stories site. SCARF is the local refugee support centre, local refugee support centre. Their volunteers already tutor school students in the library, and they have interviews with people on their website who've come to the area as refugees. Kumaditchi is a local Aboriginal cultural centre. They have local cultural stories on their website. We asked them for permission to name our study rooms after the Aboriginal names for the 5 islands off the coast here. And they also allowed us to display images and text from their children's book, The 5 Islands Story, painted by local children. In this way, we can make prominent Aboriginal knowledge systems in the library. Italians in Wollongong collect stories and photos from migrants from Italy, and as well as the website link to their site, they also donate hard copies of their blog to our manuscript collection for preservation. And next slide, thank you. Council Community Services are now approaching the library to preserve and make accessible the results of projects within the community, including art projects such as Artwood, in which 6 artists were funded to involve the community in creating art in response to place. Also local mural projects. The Coaldale one was based on a poem written about the area, which we could include the audio and the transcript on the site. We also host a link to the Living Book program and panel discussions by people living with a disability and members of Wollongong's LGBTQI community shared their lived experiences, and they were recorded, and these recordings are hosted on our Illawarra Stories site. Next slide. So in the planning stage coming up, we have 2 photo exhibitions, one with the local migrant heritage group and one with Honk Oz, a yearly street music festival, and we'll be showcasing and preserving the history of these groups through images. And another project we've just been invited to partner in, which didn't make the slides, is with people who are part of the Aboriginal community at a place called Hill 60, who were moved off their lands in World War II by the Federal Defence Forces. We're looking forward to help facilitating the telling of their stories too. And just my contact details, or our contact details, are on this last slide. So if you would like any more information about any of these things presented, please contact us at localhistory@wollongong.nsw.gov.au. And any questions if I've got any time, but maybe time's up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jo. I'll say to everyone, because we don't have any formal question time in this session, but I'm sure Jo would be happy to answer questions in chat. So please, for the rest of this afternoon, get your questions in through chat. That would be great. So thank you, Jo. Now we have Ella Turner from Alice Springs Public Library. And if Ella is there, I will just throw to her now. Give me one moment. Okay, so please welcome Ella Turner.
Thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, great. So firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge the Central Aranda people as the traditional custodians of the land on which I am today in Mparntwe, Alice Springs. I pay my respects to their history, culture, and their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I'd also like to extend my thanks to Alice Woods from Wikimedia Australia, who also happens to be a former Special Collections Coordinator here at Alice Springs Public Library, who proposed this partnership. I know she's in the audience today, so thank you to Alice for your generous support. So I'll just go to the next slide, please. Oh, no, this is the first slide, yeah. Just as a background to Alice Springs, the Aranda people are the traditional owners of Mparntwe, Alice Springs. It has a population of about 26,000. 20.6% of residents identify as Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander, and this is compared to just under 4% of the national population. Within the population, 48.2% of one or both parents are born overseas, and the most common languages used at home other than English are Aranda, Malayalam, Punjabi, Tagalog, and Warlpiri. So Aranda and Warlpiri are both local languages. Warlpiri country is located in the Tanami Desert, northwest of Alice Springs. And so as you can see, Alice Springs has a very diverse population, and as with all libraries, we aim to create collections that reflect the diversity of our population demographics and communities. So next slide, please. So the Alice Springs collection is a reference collection at the library, which collects materials relating to the unique history, geography, social, cultural, and economic fabric of the Central Australian region. It includes 2 Indigenous specific collections, a culture anam, which means giving knowledge, and local languages. And it also holds a significant digital collection, including the Central Australian Historical Images Collection. And these images represent not only Alice Springs, but surrounding Central Australian communities. I was just going to say back at the previous slide, just as an aside, that young gentleman in the picture is one of our library officers, Carl, and he's the only staff member who was born and bred in Alice Springs, because it's a very transient population. And luckily for us, he has a passion for local history, so his knowledge is really valuable to us. So next slide, please. So most of the Central Australian Historical Images collection is made up of images collected by two local historians, Jeff Purdy and Barry Allwright. They wanted to preserve as much Central Australian photographic history as possible due to a concern that long-term residents often leave Alice Springs, it being quite a transitory town, and take their photographs with them. And when residents die, their photos are often destroyed or dispersed to family throughout Australia. And Jeff and Barry wanted the images to be available to the general public, especially writers and historians. So up until now, this collection has actually only been available to view on an intranet system in the library. The library is really wanting to create accessible online local history collections. However, our resources are quite limited. So this partnership has been really exciting for us. Needless to say, being online makes the images infinitely more discoverable. So next slide, please. And I'm just in the chat, just going to put a link so you can see the uploads of Alice Springs Public Library on the Wikimedia Commons. I realise that probably would have been a more useful slide to include, although the camels are quite nice as well. So in terms of uploading images to the Commons, Alice Woods from Wikimedia created a procedure for us and trained two staff members, myself and Carl, who you saw earlier, and an open source software program called PattyPan is used. And while we at the library are just at the beginning of learning how to do this ourselves, it's clearly a very user-friendly process. So next slide, please. So the first collection to be uploaded to the Commons was the Donald and Isabel Dowling collection. This is a collection made up of 241 black and white images taken between 1938 and 1948. And among other things, the images capture the impact that World War II had on the township. So next slide, please. So during the war, Alice Springs became the civilian capital of the Northern Territory, as well as an active military base, and the population increased to 8,000 at its peak. And prior to the war, Alice's population was less than 500. So next slide, please. So the second collection to be uploaded was the Anton Feynman collection. It is made up of 81 colour images taken between 1957 and 1958 by Anton Feynman, an Austrian traveller who worked on the construction of the Stuart Highway. The next slide, please. So the collection provides a nice contrast to the Dowling collection with obviously more colour as well as more portraiture. Alice, who's very familiar with the collection, actually chose this collection for its joyful depiction of Alice Springs, and specifically because of its focus on the people of Alice Springs. Next slide, please. So as well as being able to browse images under the category Central Australian Historical Images, some of the images has also been added to various Wikipedia pages. So, and this enhances the general interest and historical value of these pages. The next slide, please. And for many of the pages they were added to, they were the first Creative Commons images available. And I know Alice created this page using the images from the Alice Springs Historical Images collection. So next slide, please. So it's important to note that one of both Wikimedia's and the library's major concerns about making these images available online was to ensure we were being culturally sensitive, as many of the images include First Nations people. Fortunately, in 2019, the library employed Braden Kanjiri, a traditional owner from Ontario, Hermansburg, east of Alice Springs, to undertake a cultural sensitivity assessment of the Alice Springs collection, which included the historical images. Braden had worked around the world primarily through the Strello Research Centre in the repatriation of Arrernte knowledge and objects. And he worked with Colleen Powell from Nataria Mungana, who was the library's Indigenous Services Officer at the time. So the images were categorised via a traffic light system, green for OK, orange for caution, and red for restricted. And to follow cultural sensitivity and safety, those images listed as either orange or red aren't going to be uploaded to Wikimedia Commons. So additionally, the project has and will continue to be informed by the guidelines for First Nations collections description, published last year on open access, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. And these guidelines, I mean, they're relevant for everyone, but it's very relevant to our collections, particularly because we have a large Aboriginal population who use the library a lot and engage with the collections, including perhaps especially the images collections. So next slide, please. So Alice from Wikimedia again trained staff in using the Glamorgan tool to measure views, and this gives you a snapshot of the number of views the images have had since the Dowling collection was uploaded last December. And it's super exciting to see these numbers and great inspiration to continue uploading further collections, considering prior to this, the images were only being seen maybe a handful of times a day or a week. So next slide, please. So, and finally, this is just a sneak preview of the next collection to be uploaded, the Tao Conrick collection. This collection is made up of 21 black and white images from the late 40s to the early 50s, and again, gives a unique and invaluable insight into the history of Mparntwe. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ella. I think that really highlights the value of historical image collections and the role local studies can play in making sure that they're available for the community. So thank you so much. We're moving on to Steph Gill-Daly from Georges River Council. So I will throw
Hi everyone. Can you hear me? Everything sort of went really silent really quick there.
we can hear you, Steph.
Brilliant. All right, so my name is Steph. I'm from Georges River Libraries. I'm just gonna talk about our historical markers program that we've got going. So if we want to go to the the next slide. Our councils had more amalgamated councils. So we had a historical marker-esque program across both Hurstville City and Kogarah City councils. And then if we go to the next slide, what we did is in 2018, we launched the Georges River One, which sort of redesigned the looks of the markers that we put in, and then from now on, this is how we're going to go forward in recognising places and people of significance in the area. It also does meet one of our outcomes from our library strategy, which is to develop and support programs that highlight the diverse migration histories and contemporary stories to reflect the richness of the multicultural community. So a big part of this program is the nominations are all community-based. So what we do, I'm getting ahead of myself already here. If we go to the next slide. So on the side here, you'll see an example of what our historical markers look like. So they're a nice teal color plate that you'll find in footpaths and stone plinths like this around the area, and they're very recognizable. Since the start of the program, we've installed 29 markers of the new ones throughout the local government area. And to give you a bit of an idea, there was about 160 odd markers previously from both councils. So there's quite a lot of stuff going on, but we're moving towards this one now. Some examples, some notable examples of markers we've put in is Joe Anderson, which you can see in the picture there. We've got Ellesmere Camp, Isaac Peaks Farm, Shipwrights Bay, and John Radeski. So our markers cover a range of places, people, businesses, I guess, that were sort of critical to the cultural and the natural heritage of the area. If we go to the next slide. So in order to make this program a success, so obviously, like every council, we've got a policy for stuff. So our historical markers policy covers everything from nomination process, how we assess the selection of sites, as well as the approval process, our design and placement of plaques, and all of the information management around the program. This is a publicly available policy as well. So when it comes to community putting their nominations in, everyone has the information up front, so they got no surprises about what it is that we're doing. If we go to the next slide. So a little bit more about the program itself. So when we look at the structure of the program, what we do is we put out a call out to the community, and we use our Your Say platform. Most councils got a community engagement platform. We put it out on there. It has a series of questions that people can answer and put in their research. And then once we close that off, we'll have an evaluation panel, which is outlined in that policy, and we'll review along the criteria, and then we make recommendations to our executive team and council. Once they're approved and accepted, we do a launch event and an announcement during History Week, where it's obviously open to the whole public, but we also specifically invite everyone that's put a nomination in. And very recently, we started not pre-announcing them. We only announce them at that event. So you get this really nice moment where the people who put the nominations in find out, as everyone finds out, that theirs was a winning one. So the lady in the photograph here, having her photo taken with the marker, her nomination was one of the successful ones from last year's program, and she was super happy, and she even jumped up and celebrated in the middle of it. So it's quite nice to see that engagement sort of happen in real life, not just over the emails and whatnot. After we do the announcement, we have them manufactured so we can show people, we then get them installed. And then we have a number of places on the internet where we sort of store all this information so people can find them. We have a page dedicated to it on the council website, which lists all of our markers where they are, a brief little sort of overview of what they're about. And then we also have an online tour, which I've got a slide a little later on. I'll talk about that a little bit more then. Some of the stuff that we've experimented with before with this program was how long we leave those nominations open for. We've recently landed to having them open for quite a few months now. So what we do is we, at the same event that we announce the current year's markers, which is during History Week, we will then open the next year's nominations up, and they'll stay open until the end of Heritage Festival. So it gives a nice almost half a year for everyone to really be able to research what they want to nominate, use the collection, and sort of put in a thorough one. We had a couple of years where we had very, I guess, minimal detail in our nominations. So we just thought we'd try and change it up and see if that helps. If we go to the next slide. So in terms of making a nomination for people, for the community, what they need to provide us with is we've got obviously their contact details that we can get back to them, what they want the marker to be about. We also have the criteria laid out in the nomination form, so people can't get distracted about not distracted, sorry, can't get confused about why they're nominating someone. So they have to choose, and they can do multiple choice, but they can choose between the criteria that is set out in the policy. They'll also put their rationale for this, so why they would like to nominate that person or place or I guess activity, and then there's areas for them to put in their research, complete with a location that they would like the marker, and images as well. So if we go to the next one, so this is the criteria that they get to choose from. So the site must be of cultural or natural importance to Georges River, New South Wales or Australia. So it does recognise that sometimes things happen that it's not just in our own little world, it can go further than that, which is quite nice. And then under that, they've got the option of having a strong or special association with the life or work of a person or group of people, a strong or special association with a particular community group or cultural group, marks and contributes to an understanding of the area's cultural or natural history, or demonstrates special characteristics of a cultural or natural place. So yes, we go to this next one. We have two main ways that we physically install the markers. You've seen some of the pictures had those sandstone plinths, but it's not necessarily practical to put a big sandstone plinth in the middle of like a busy town centre or outside people's houses if it's a one that's sort of out in front of people's houses. So we have also the markers inset in concrete or the footpaths, and they kind of look like the example on the screen there. They are made of an aluminium, which means you can walk over them and they don't get damaged. So they're very durable, but it just provides us two different options. In terms of installing markers, so we've had a couple of questions come into us about our marker program, both from other councils and from community members about where they can put markers. One of the biggest things that we have to do is we put it on council-owned land, so then we're not beholden to developers who come in and want to rebuild a house or an apartment area. So we're in charge of where they go. We can make sure they're upkept, all of that. Just saw a question in there about do we have trouble with vandalism? We don't actually. Fingers crossed at the moment that doesn't change, because they are quite huge, and you definitely need a crane to pull out those stones. So they come up to about waist height, so they're pretty big. And then if we go to the next one, so this is the fun bit that I was alluding to before with the online tours. I've just popped the link into the chat. What we've also done is over the last couple of years, it started as a bit of a COVID project. We started an online resource, and you can download it as an app as well, called Connected to Culture. And we have used a lot of our content, our images from the local history collection, to put them available for people online to read through and access in a little bit simpler way than having to be hardcore researchers themselves. It's a little bit similar to, say, Joe's Illawarra Stories. It's just not predominantly based upon the oral histories, which Illawarra Stories was based upon and then grew from. Ours sort of just grew from lots of stories. So on the Connected to Culture, you can go in there, and we've put a virtual tour for the markers. So the picture on the screen there just shows you a little bit of an idea of what it looks like. It has all of the markers. You can click on them. It will show you photos of the marker. It will show you photos, if we've got them, of the people or the place. It's got some stories about it. So that research that people send in to us, and we also conduct our own research, all sort of ties in. It's a really nice way for them to be purposely discovered, which complements the whole, if you're out walking around the community, you'll find them by pure serendipity. So the next thing that we are looking at doing is finding a way to attach like a semi-permanent QR code, which brings people back to the tour or to the story page about that marker, so they can find more information. So yeah, and then if you do have any other questions, I'm happy to chat historical markers all the time. And I think my time's almost up, but I do have a question from Alison about how our staff are involved. So all of our staff are involved. It does take up a bit of time when the end of the nomination period comes in, because we do a load of research just to verify what people have nominated to us, and then we jump on the panel, and we'll then sort of go through it and evaluate against that criteria. But all in all, it's a really worthwhile venture for us, because it also does bring in new stories and new content and new engagement with people from the community who hear about it. And I will say the last couple of years, we are getting more varied and more diverse nominations, which is really great to see for us as well, because we kind of want to acknowledge the whole of the Georges River. And that's me.
Okay, thanks so much, Steph. I'm a Georges River resident, and I saw a marker right near my house, so I'm going to go check it out
Nice.
after this finishes. So Alison had a question for you, and now I'm going to throw to Alison from Woollahra Library, who's going to be talking about an informal network for local history exhibition curators. So over to you, Alison.
Thanks, Michael, and I'll just wait for you to put up my, oh, there we go. Thanks for the slides. Everyone can hear me okay?
Yep.
Great, thank you. Next slide, please. So I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians, and while Woollahra is in Gadigal and Birrabiggal country, I'm coming to you today from Bidjigal country. Next slide, please. So earlier this year, while I was still working at Bayside Council, I started a small group for social history curators who are working in local government. The aims of the group are to support each other, share ideas and information, and learn from each other's professional practice, much like the local studies groups that Ellen and others coordinate. So I know that most of the audience I'm talking to today are probably not social history curators, but you might know people in your networks who are, and you might be interested in the process and the how and the why of setting up this group. So I've worked as a curator in national and state institutions for about 20 years, and during that time I always had other colleagues to talk to about my work. But when I started working as a social history curator for Bayside Council, I found that I had no colleagues I could talk to who understood what a social history curator did on a day-to-day basis and what it involved. And that's to be expected because I was working in a library context. Next slide, please. So I felt quite isolated, and I was wondering if there were other social history curators in the local government setting out there who were feeling the same way. So all of this was going on in my mind. And then in November 2023, I went to a free professional development day, which was provided by the Powerhouse Museum, which people in Sydney will know of, and it was a regional stakeholders forum. So it was aimed at people who lived outside of Sydney or worked in a regional context. And I was one of the presenters at the forum, spoke about a network which she had set up for small museums, many of which are run by volunteers and local historical societies on the south coast of New South Wales. And this small network meets for breakfast every 2 months, and they talk shop and support each other. Next slide, please. So I thought that this might be a useful model for me and hopefully fill a need. And just as a small aside in this presentation, I'd just like to point out that inspiration can come at any moment. And when I think about this and talk to my manager, I just think it's important to remember that professional development days might not seem directly applicable to your work at the time, but they can provide a space to think and to reflect, and they can still be inspiring. So I now had a need, and I had a potential model or way of meeting that need. So how did I go about putting these two together? Next slide, please. I started slowly and built gently, and I think the snail is an apt image because I really did have to feel my way. I explained the situation to my supervisor, and I got her permission to spend some time setting up a network. And then I contacted 3 social history curators in the south and southwest of Sydney, where I was working at the time. and asked them if they'd be interested in meeting to discuss their curatorial projects and to exchange information. Everybody I contacted was keen, and miraculously, we managed to find a date that suited everyone in January 2024. Next slide, please. So I invited these 3 curators to come and view an exhibition that I'd curated, which was on display at Mascot Library, which is part of Bayside Council. And I provided everyone with a simple vegetarian lunch. So I decided it would be better to meet for lunch rather than breakfast, because it really is best to avoid travelling in peak hour in Sydney if you can do that. So the image on your left that you'll see is Christine Moss, who is a former member of the Bayside community, pointing to a photograph of herself as a very little girl. Her grandmother is holding her and standing on the veranda of their home in Botany. So Christine donated and loaned lots of items for the exhibition, and it's the close involvement of local residents in local history exhibitions which makes curating these exhibitions so different in a local government context to curating them in a national and state institution. So next slide, please. So here's a photograph of the 4 curators, Alinda, Jenny, Claire and myself, viewing the exhibition. And when they did that, I asked them 2 critical questions. First of all, what did you like about it? And secondly, what would you do differently? And I certainly found it very useful to get feedback from my peers, because it differs from the sort of feedback that you get from members of the public who visit an exhibition. And we gather that feedback through a visitors' comments book and from talking to visitors as well. Because peers can provide a critical appraisal and approach the exhibition from a maker or a creator position rather than a consumer's perspective. So after viewing the exhibition, people shared their responses to these 2 questions, and we chatted over lunch about a range of things that our managers and our colleagues probably wouldn't have much of a background in. Next slide, please. So if some of the words that I've listed on the left-hand side of this slide don't mean anything to you, that's okay, because these are some of the things that people who work in exhibitions talk about all the time, and we were keen to exchange information about these. So a lot of this is about the what and the how we do what we do. So over lunch, we were able to talk about the projects we were working on, grant funding opportunities, which suppliers we use for printing and framing, how we produce our exhibition labels and the products we use, how we publicise and promote exhibitions, whether we use an editor for our text and if they understand about text hierarchies and they understand an audience which is usually made up of streakers, strollers or students, and whether we do public programs and offer exhibition tours. So it was a really wonderful, non-competitive, engaging and exchange of information. So what's happening next? Next slide, please. So on Friday just gone, one of my colleagues at Fairfield City Museum and Gallery was planning to host a visit to her new exhibition, which is about the suburb of Villawood. However, I've probably now learned a lesson that it's not a good idea to try a face-to-face meeting in winter, because some people were sick, and if they weren't sick, some people's colleagues were sick and they were needed to staff the library or staff the exhibition spaces in their respective councils. So we kind of lost a critical mass of people to meet face-to-face and had to postpone that meeting. Which is a shame, but we will get back to it. I have also put out a call through this local studies network, or actually the New South Wales Local Studies Network, not the wider local studies one, for any other curators working in the local government context that might want to join such a network. We did have replies from 6 people, and they said they'd like to do that, but 4 of them don't live in Sydney. So we're now thinking of whether we can take this model online and possibly have maybe 3 sessions a year, which are online meetings, and 1 session a year, which is face-to-face meeting, and most likely in Sydney at this stage. And so we'll experiment with that. And once again, I'm still trying to feel my way with this. Next slide, please. I think it is quite important to respond to what people want, and I'm trying to use a co-design process to develop the network so that it's a solution that comes from the community rather than one that's imposed onto people. I've also realised by talking with people in the network that it was just myself and Jenny who worked as local history curators in a library context. Everybody else was connected to a museum within which was managed or operated by that local council, which is a very different framework to be working within. Next slide, please. So one of the other roles that I hope the exhibition one of the other roles that I hope this network can fulfill is to try and raise the profile of each other's spaces. The exhibitions that are put on in small council-run museums are often excellent, but they don't get the marketing support and local councils don't have the budgets that national and state-run institutions do have to promote those exhibitions. And I think that as a network, we can support each other and cross-promote our exhibitions and those spaces. And so to this end, I've been recommending that we write reviews of the exhibitions and publish them in blogs and things like that. Thanks, Michael, got your note. And so I've written a review about the Villawood Between Hope and Hopelessness exhibition, and then it'll be published in History Australia Journal in July. Next slide. That was the one about the reviews. Next slide. So if anyone knows a social history curator who would like to join this very fledgling network, please get in touch, and we can accommodate interstate curators if we can meet online. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks so much, Alison. A very worthwhile initiative. I think most of the work people are doing today, whether it's curating exhibitions or other local studies work, it can be a very lonely space. So the more collaboration and feedback you can get from your colleagues, the better. So our last speaker today is Samita Biswas from Yarra City Libraries, who is going to be talking about family history for people of Indian and Sri Lankan origin.
Hello, everybody, and namaste. I pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people, where I'm presently located, and also bring greetings from my ancestors in India and Sri Lanka. So next slide, please. And I apologize for the size of my presentation. It is meant to be a handout, which people can print out to help people of Indian origin. So the Indian diaspora around the world is huge, as we know. These stats are not very accurate for the moment, but this was the easiest map I found. Next slide, please. And again, with the colonial history, the spread of Indian population has taken place throughout the world. These are some facts where the Indians had migrated and where they settled. Next one, please. Sri Lankan diaspora, same thing. There are about 3 million Sri Lankans who live overseas. Again, these are some stats where they are located. So the culture of India has been shaped by the history and geography and diverse, but it is very, very ancient. And with its tradition and civilization dating back to 8,000 BC, and but with the population that is with the population that is spreading to other countries due to various reasons that I will be stating in my presentation, and the influence of Western culture, the family history of Indians, Sri Lankans, and many people from Southeast Asia is disappearing. And there are some reasons to it. While in Western world, there has been a lot of recording of the histories like census, electoral roll, shipping, etc. That's not how it has been in India and Sri Lanka. And And as a result of it, there is a lot of reliance on people's memories. And that is where it becomes quite difficult. Next slide, please. So we have talked a lot about oral history and the importance of oral history. And in the Indian context for Sri Lankans, Indians, it is the oral history, which is actually the family history. And next slide, please. And it is what we remember, what the people remember. We have seen that in 4 generations, the family history or the Indian family history and Sri Lankan family has been lost. It's only what we remember from where our parents and grandparents have passed it on to us from very early childhood. Next slide. And the reasons for this is with the younger generation migrating out, all the stories remained with the ancestors, and with them passing away, this was never noted. The people who migrated were too busy settling, and they knew the stories, but they didn't have time to go back and record the stories. They were too busy settling in a new country. Also, there was no official registration of births and deaths. So that was another problem. There were no proper records kept. And so there is nothing much available for research today. Next slide. And as I said, so in absence of written records, what I tell everybody is please just start now, whatever you know now. So for me, I know stories of 4 generations of my ancestors in my head. So just start consulting your seniors, start recording whatever you have. Next slide. And in this context of family history research, personal records are the most important thing. And the next few slides till slide 20 are just images that I have recorded. So if Michael, you can just skip to the slides because these are images. And the reason why I put the images is the documents in India look very different. Some of the documents even have photographs. So it can become quite an important of history. Now with Indian passport, the important thing in Indian passports, it often has name of your parents and your last known address. So that could be a very important document for you to know. If you're your mother's or grandparents' passport, then you would know who were your great-grandparents. Next slide, please. For the Fiji Indians, the Fijian Grammid passes. These were the passes that were issued to them when they entered Fiji. And often they will have that family history details. And that could be the only detail they would know of which village in India they originated from. Next one. The church and parish records were better because at least there was some record. Next one. Next one. Land records are very important because you can see there are photographs of owners and buyers. So, if you have a history, go through the history of land records. If you know your family-owned history or their family-owned history, then you can go and find the people, sometimes the ancestral lands, you will have the details. Next one. Often school and university certificates are used because that was the only birth date was only available in that record. Next one. Letters, diaries, photographs, which are the next slides. These were sometimes the only clues that was available to record the family history. Next one. Interesting fact is that Indian family history, Sri Lankan, they are all often in families. They don't think it's important to share. Often handwritten, and this is on the right is my own family history, which my cousin shared with me, just handwritten. Often only the male lineage is recorded. So, missing female members of the family. Next one. Some of the tips for the family history research is in India, there was a lot of migration from other parts of the world. And these the migration that happened often influenced the surnames, the people who settled their cultures. Next one. So the Indian surnames. Please, if you're helping anybody with Indian or Sri Lankan family research, please note their surnames. The surnames are so important. Next one. So an example of that would be how my name came through. So my, often the wife would take the husband's first and the last name. So for example, my married name was Smita Soumitra Biswas, where Soumitra was my husband's name. So often such things can give clues. Next one, please. And these are some common examples of surnames. So please pay attention to the surnames. They often will tell you which part of India, which religion they follow. It's really interesting to note, to get somebody started with the family history, Indian family history research. Next one. Partition of India had a huge effect on the records. So a lot of family history records were lost because when there was a partition, there were huge riots, all the records were burned. So when people from Pakistan migrated to India and vice versa, records were lost to riots. So it is often always asked those questions. Were your ancestors in, did they migrate during 1947? So that is very important to know. During that period, also there was a lot of migration overseas, and also, of course, the endangered laborers who were taken by the British colony to the various British colonies all over the Commonwealth, all over the world. Next one. So the major challenge for finding Hindu ancestors is they were cremated. There were no real records maintained, and often the records were maintained in temples, which were lost. Next one. These are some records. Again, it's quite difficult to decipher them, but if people have family priests, they could find some records. Next one. So there is a little section on Indian genealogy on family.search. That's the best I have found so far when I started my research, but it is not really very helpful for if you have ancestors in India. Next one. These are some of the recordings. Again, this is not really helpful, but it's good for research. Next one. These are some historical records again, and this is again taken from the Family Search website. Next one. There are some pilgrimage records which are not really helpful. You can see this is in a language, it needs to be translated, so not very useful when you're trying to help somebody with family. But it's sometimes families have these records. It's good to check with them. Next one. Some of the Muslim records, the marriage records are important, and sometimes they're located in mosques. Next one. The Indian church and parish records, this is useful if they were when their ancestors who were British, who were Anglo-Indians, or they were British who were settled in India during the time of the colonial rule. Next one. Next one. Now, if there are people who have come to Australia and New Zealand, then the records become better because then the immigration records are there for them, passenger lists and other things that can. So, Michael, if you skip through some of those slides, because these are all results from ancestry.com. Yeah, and of course, the birth dates and marriages in Victoria. Yeah, if for the Fiji, people of Fiji, there are very good records available, again, when they entered Fiji, and they are available at the National Library of Australia. So the passes are available, the original passes or digitized copies of them. Next one. This is a very good website, again, for people whose ancestors came from India. Next one. This is the research tool for Anglo-Indians or British Europeans in people from 1600 to 1949. Next one. So with Sri Lankan family history, the main thing is there are three different ancestries. One is the Tamilian, the Sinhalese, and the Dutch. So these are the next few slides that Michael, if you skip to the next one, please. So the next one. Again, the Sri Lankan names, surnames are very important. They give an indication of where the person could be from. So this one, the De Fonseca side, is the best one for getting started with the Sri Lankan family history. The next one, please. Next one. So this is the Sinhalese family tree. So as I said, Sri Lankan ancestry, three main ancestry. One is the Sinhalese families. The next one, the Ceylon Tamils. This is the Tamilians who migrated from India to Sri Lanka. Next one. And the Dutch. So these are the three main ancestries. For more contemporary, you can check the social media and Facebook groups. I found quite a few. If people are looking for some of the relatives who could have moved to Australia or New Zealand. Next one. Same with temples and mosques. They would have contact details sometimes. Next one. Local newspapers, again, regional newspapers are a good source because they could have birth, deaths, marriages. The best source that I've found for Indian family history is this website, which was launched last year. It's the I Me Us view. So this is what I have found, that they are actually starting to document, which is not found in ancestry.com, which is not found on family history. This was made where they have started recording all the data and authoritative data that can be used for family history research. Next one, please.
So sorry, just to interrupt, Sumita, we're kind of just on time now.
Yeah.
Just to finish up, can you maybe tell us how much take up you're getting? Like, how are you getting this sort of these research tips out to the community?
So I probably started my journey back in New Zealand when there was nothing. And I would engage community groups would come to me. Since then, probably this article has been published in a blog in Auckland Libraries where I used to work, and I get a lot of inquiries through that. When I'm here at Yarra Libraries, there is at the moment during the Family History Month, I run a lot of workshops. Then I have gone to, when I worked in Melton, I did that too. So this is a more of an attempt to get some resources to the librarians to get started. It's not by all means, because there was nothing when I started. So as I said to Ellen, this can be used as a handout because there are lots of tips. If you have got a customer coming in that I have a relation who could be Indian or Sri Lankan, but I don't know how to get to them, this could be something that they could use. Also, I'm very happy to be contacted. My contact details are in the last slide. If you're stuck, if there are questions regarding that you have a customer in family history research and you don't know how to proceed, I'm very, very happy to help because I'm probably answering lots of queries on my own all the time.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll just quickly share that last slide for anyone who wants the details. And that gets us to the end of the day. I know there's been a lot of great questions for the panel in the chat. So thank you for that. Just a reminder, as I said before, to anyone who is not registered for tomorrow, make sure you do so because it is a separate link to jump on. And Ellen, I believe Sumita's presentation, the other presentations will be available in the wiki. Is that correct?
It's correct. They'll be available next week sometime.
Yeah. So so we can get them all there. So okay, so I'll just stop sharing this. Okay, so hope we can join hope everyone can join us tomorrow for the second and final day. It's been a great day today, a lot of fascinating talk. So I'm looking forward to hearing more tomorrow. So thank you all for joining us today.